First of all, harkeli surpazan hayr shachno ragalink for yagadzek. Merci for karad. Surpazan hayr. Thanks to everybody to coming. This is the Armenian Institute, and for some of you, it'll be your first time here. We've only been here. It feels like a few days, but it's actually been a couple of years. But we're still sort of finding our way in the neighborhood and rearranging the space. But we hope you'll come back at another time when you can peruse the books and journals and all the wonderful things that we have here. And all of you online, also welcome to you, and please do come in and see our space here. You think you'll really enjoy it when you come. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Christopher Sheklian this evening, where I've heard of Chris's work for a long time now, and we're really pleased he's a neighbor over in the Netherlands at the moment, was able to come over. He's doing a postdoc, 3-year postdoc at the University of Radboud. And he's part of the Rewriting Global Orthodoxy project. And as Chris was explaining to me, this is one of the few places where they bring together different Orthodox and Orthodox related churches to connect with each other, to talk about what's going on and to learn more. Correct me if I'm
that's good.
Using my
That's
imagination
true.
too much, but this is how I understood it. It's in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion, so it's already a good combination. He's an anthropologist, which is great, a fellow anthropologist from the University of Chicago. And his dissertation there was Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority Tradition and Secularism in Turkey. And that would be a really interesting thing for a future talk, I think. It'd be great to have that. Yeah, do come back. He's also served as the director of the Zohrab Institute in New York City for 3 years, and has been a Mandugian postdoctoral fellow in Armenian studies at the University of Michigan. And an adjunct professor at St. Nerses Seminary. Right now, he's working on a monograph entitled Liturgical Rites, Armenian Religious Minority Belonging in Turkey. So follow-up to the PhD. Again, thank you for coming, and big thanks to Chris for being here tonight. Turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction and for working with me to finally get me here. I think we met online, I don't know, it's been probably close to a year now, and I kept saying, I'll come. And so it's thrilling to actually be here. I have to say, you know, she mentioned a fellow anthropologist. When I started my PhD work, there was almost nobody to look to that had done anthropology of Armenians. And Susan, your book was one of the only ones, and also that, you know, it's titled Faith and History, that it had anything at all to do with the church and the study of religion was a near miracle for me to discover when I first started my PhD. So it's really thrilling to be here, and I very much appreciate it. Sarpazan, thank you for your attendance. Thank you everybody who is here, both present and online. And I'm really excited to share this work. We're going to begin with a bit of kind of overview, and then we're going to move into some of the material that has been collected in part through the project at Radboud University. So I'll get the chance to talk a little bit about the project Rewriting Global Orthodoxy and how it fits in to what I will be talking about this evening. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully everybody both here and online gets to see everything. We've got the sound. We've practiced this, so hopefully we should be set. And then I'm going to play from the beginning, and I'm going to go like this. And I think that should have everything. We should also hopefully have captions, which is a nice thing, actually. Great. So tonight I'm going to talk about Armenians as part of the Oriental Orthodox family of Christian churches. I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of background as to what exactly this group is, what we mean by this, and then move into some contemporary ethnographic work a little bit, the kinds of work that I've done as an anthropologist over the years, to think about what, especially in Europe, this family of churches looks like. So I will begin with a little bit of a vignette based off of this picture here. So, there we go. So in May of 2022, last year, I went from our little town of Nijmegen on the edge of the German border of the Netherlands, and I took the train into Amsterdam to attend the Choral Festival 2022. One of the, my Dutch is terrible, but one of the wonderful things is when you look at it, you can almost see it there. So Choral Festival, all right, the Choir Festival. The Choir Festival brought together all of the Oriental Orthodox churches of specifically the city, but because the Netherlands is a nice connected country, we had people coming from different parts of the country as well, but it was represented by each of the different churches. It was held at the Coptic Orthodox Cathedral of St. Mary, just in the north of the city of Amsterdam. And you get a little view here of the Coptic church. And a number of different churches participated. So here we have an example from the participation of the Syriac Church. The common language of the day was Dutch. So we have this nice Dutch translation of the Syriac liturgical hymns. And each of the different choirs presented their own liturgical music. For a lot of us, the most interesting and exciting was the participation of both the Ethiopian and this is the Eritrean Tewahedo Orthodox Church. And I'm going to show a little bit from them because the Tewahedo rite is one of the only ancient Christian churches that has retained a real kind of liturgical dance and a use of instruments. The Armenian churches, you might know, will use the kushot. You get a little bit of instrumentation. But for those of us who are not part of the Tewahedo tradition, it's always sort of exciting to see. So I'm going to get a little bit of video and sound here from this choir show. So just to give you a flavor of what the day was like, I chose that instead of Armenian choir music. I've been told that maybe, I'll have to sing some hymns later to give the example of that. But each of these different churches came together in the city of Amsterdam and presented their own specific liturgical music for everybody else. And the participants were almost, the attendees, I should say, were almost entirely from the different churches. It was kind of fun watching the pews go from attendees to go up to the stage to take their turn and to come back. So I want to start with this because it's this wide diversity of Christian churches. So we see here folks from the Tewahedo rite, the Armenian church we can envision. The signage from the previous slide had the Syriac and the Dutch translation. And the question maybe for some of us might be, what do all of these churches have in common? It seems like a wild, diverse array of Christian traditions. To answer that, I'm going to step back in time a little bit. First, did that twice. First, I'm going to step back in time not too far away to 1965. In 1965, in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, then Emperor Haile Selassie convened a meeting of all of what would then actually for the first time be called the Oriental Orthodox Churches. At this meeting, this was one of the first times that this term was used. So who are these churches? Well, at first, actually, the Emperor of Ethiopia thought he was going to bring all of the Orthodox churches together. But at the last minute, they changed their minds and they said, we're only going to take the non-Chalcedonian churches. I'm going to come back to this. Don't be worried. We're only going to take the non-Chalcedonian churches because we want to discuss the fact of them being in communion with each other. We want to talk about how these churches are supposed to recognize each other in the fullness of their sacraments, that they could go to each other's churches and take communion, that they could be intermarried with each other at each other's services without any problems, technically. And so the emperor brought together a number of high-ranking officials from all of these different churches. And in fact, if we look at this picture, you might even see a couple faces that you recognize there. He managed to bring together, for the first time since the 5th century, the heads of the Ethiopian church, which had only recently become autonomous from the Coptic church. So they were the hosts. Technically, at that moment, it was Abuna Basilios, the first head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, but a lot of the work was done by the bishop Abuna Theophilus. The patriarch was, I believe at that time, already a little bit ill. So these two Ethiopian patriarchs headed it. Pope Cyril VI of the Coptic Church was there, the Coptic Church being the church based out of Alexandria, out of present-day Egypt. More Ignatius Jacob III of the Syriac Church, traditionally based in what is today southern Turkey, but has been in Damascus for a while. Basilios Agen I of the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church. We can see here, perhaps you recognize Catholicos Vasken I, as well as Catholicos Horen I of the Great House of the Sea of Cilicia. So the two Armenian Catholicosates, both were represented. So all of these heads of these different churches were brought together in order to discuss their unity. And that was the first time that they used this term, the Oriental Orthodox. Why? Oriental just means Eastern, and we talk about the Eastern Orthodox churches, and it was a way of distinguishing from the other Eastern Orthodox churches, the Greek, the Russian, what's often known under the Byzantine Rite. And so the idea is the term Oriental, I mean, you could say Eastern and Oriental mean the same thing, but by giving them different names, you distinguish these groups of Orthodox, broadly Orthodox Christians. And since then, there has been a decent amount of cooperation between these churches, these very distinct churches. And we give them the name, the Oriental Orthodox. Some people will still choose other names. An older term is the Lesser Eastern. We're going to come to the technical term from theology in a moment. And in fact, to understand why did Emperor Haile Selassie bring these particular heads of these churches together, you actually have to go back to the last time they were all in a room together, to about the year, well, before the year 451, indeed. So you have to go back to the early years of Christianity. This map here is showing you a number of cities that were considered to be some of the most important sees, or basically the place where the bishop resided in early Christianity. So you see Rome there. Rome, of course, becomes the Catholic Church. Constantinople, Byzantium, Istanbul becomes the head of the Eastern Orthodox, or the, now we think sort of the Greek Orthodox. We call the patriarch who sits there now the ecumenical patriarch. You see also Antioch, present-day Antakya, which has actually just recently been very devastated by the earthquakes in Turkey, ancient Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And these were sort of the most important places in the early Christian world where bishops who resided there were very, very important. These were important cities in the emerging Byzantine Empire, right? Late Roman becomes the Eastern Roman, becomes the Byzantine Empire. And these were important cities, and the bishops who were there were deeply important. And early on, these bishops started to disagree about the details of the Christian faith. So, crucially, once Christianity became sort of open within the Roman Empire, the emperors began to convene councils to try to bring agreement, to say, okay, these bishops sitting in these important cities, they need to agree. We want them to agree. So famously, the first council, you probably know its name, is Nicaea, which gives us the Nicene Creed that most ancient Christian churches recite every week. comes from the Council of Nicaea in 325. Well, guess what? That didn't stop all the problems. People kept arguing about it. And over time, a particular controversy broke out about the nature of Jesus. How do we describe who Jesus Christ is? This is the central figure, of course, in Christianity, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, but also a man. How do you describe that? This became the central problem for theological thinking around the 300s and 400s. And in particular, St. Cyril, so if we go back, who was the bishop in Alexandria, and a bishop who became the bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, but who was trained in Antioch, argued over the details of how you should describe Jesus. I'm not going to go into the technical stuff here. If we want to in questions, I will do my best to put on my theologian's hat. But the main point is that St. Cyril and Nestorius argued about these details. So in 451, there was another council. This one is the fourth one that the emperor convened. Not the same emperor, but the emperors over time convened. And this one tried to come to some agreement about who Jesus Christ was and to settle this once and for all and bring unity to all the bishops and all the Christians in the empire. Famously, it gives, I don't know if we can actually see my cursor right here, the idea of two natures in one person or one hypostasis. Let's not get bogged down. The point is the idea is that the way we're going to talk about who Jesus is to say that the nature of being God and the nature of being man were combined in the single person of Jesus. This is the definition that comes out in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Well, guess what? Not all of the bishops and not all of the theologians and not all of the priests and not all of the Christians agreed to that one either. And in fact, over time, a number of people said, okay, look it. This isn't right. It doesn't sit well with how we think we should describe who Jesus is. And they turned back to Cyril of Alexandria and focused really heavily on a formula that he used, one incarnate nature of God the Word. Sometimes these arguments feel like splitting hairs, but for the theologians, for the bishops, these definitions were absolutely integral to the understanding of how Christian salvation worked. If you got it wrong, it meant that the whole mechanism by which God became man, died for the sins of humanity, and leads to Christian salvation doesn't work. So this was deeply important to these theologians. So over time, after the Council of Chalcedon in 451, people slowly kind of gave their objections to this. And I want to be clear that this happened over time. These debates happened for a couple centuries. And often they were concentrated in different parts of the empire. So in particular, the monks of Lower Egypt didn't really like the formula of Chalcedon. The monks in the area that became known as Turabdin in the south of Turkey didn't really like this. Armenians, who were outside the Byzantine Empire for the most part, also didn't really care for this. And over time, they developed their own way of thinking based heavily in Cyril of Alexandria's formula about who Jesus is, different from what the Byzantine Empire is. This becomes, today we call this way of thinking Miaphysite, one nature. An older term was monophysite, also means one. For varying reasons, monophysite became a bad word because basically it meant you were either denying the humanity or the divinity of Jesus. Mia also just means one, but it means Mia one in this way. It's an okay way. So today we talk about all of those folks who didn't agree with Chalcedon as being Miaphysite. And all over time, each of these groups formed autonomous churches. So in Egypt, the monks slowly built up their own hierarchy of a Miaphysite church. That becomes today's Coptic church. The monks in what is today south of Turkey, using the Syriac language, one of the great ancient Christian languages, also built up their own hierarchy, the Syriac Church. The Armenians had already been autonomous, and they came up with their own formula, which we're going to turn to. So having their own head, not not fully independent, not ignoring the rest of the Christian world, but having their own independent church hierarchy. So the Armenian church, it actually took about a century before Armenians officially said, you know what, this Chalcedon thing, we don't want it. And people still argue about this a little bit. I like this date at the Second Council of Divin in 554, 555, was when Armenians finally officially said, we don't accept the Council of Chalcedon. We're going to be this kind of Miaphysite thing. So over time, you have these autocephalous churches with their own heads who take on a different understanding of who Jesus is that is shared. It's not identical because each group has their own theologians. And in fact, sometimes they argued. The Armenians and the Syriac Church often argued about this. There were periods, for instance, Catholicos Sahag, as you might know, who helped support the creation of the Armenian alphabet, was for a while deposed because of politics that had to do with the way the Syriac Church was working at the time. And for a little bit of a period, about from 555 until the Council of Manasgert I wrote that date down to double check, in 726, the Armenian Church and the Syriac Church were not exactly on the same page. So these churches have not always been in perfect agreement, but they've always generally had this Miaphysite understanding of who Jesus is. And they've often had different connections. The Armenians and the Syriacs have had some of the historically the closest. The Coptic Church actually administered the Tewato Church for a very long time, until the 20th century. Even though the way they did their church services were different, the hierarchy was technically under the Coptic Church. In the 20th century, when Ethiopia, through Ethiopian independence and through the workings actually of Emperor Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian Church also became autocephalous. In 1991, when Eritrea gained independence, they also then became an autocephalous church as well. And these these things still play out actually. And I am not the expert. My colleague at Radbau is a real expert on this. But right now, the entire Tewato Church is going through a lot of convulsions related to the politics of the region, and the church has sort of argued. There have been bishops who have pulled apart and come back together, and it's been quite tumultuous. So yeah, some of these ecclesial divisions are still sort of working their way out. So what we can say is that somewhere after Chalcedon, until Emperor Haile Selassie brings everybody together in 1965, these churches were all together on the same page, more or less, but didn't necessarily, and had interactions with each other at times, but didn't necessarily think of themselves together as a family of churches. And that's the real innovation and excitement that comes in the 20th century, to say, aha, all of these are not just shared theologically together, they're going to work together as the Oriental Orthodox Churches. So that's the situation that we sort of come to. Briefly, I just want to sort of mention that at the height of the Ottoman Empire, everybody except for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is under the political domination of the Ottoman Empire, right? If we're looking at this map here, you can see, okay, here's so the Coptic Church in Ethiopia, the Syriac Church, you can see Antioch on that map, and then of course not all of historic Armenia, but a significant portion of historic Armenia is under Ottoman control for several hundred years. So what that means is that even though it was Emperor Haile Selassie who brings everybody together and says, we're all going to be the Oriental Orthodox Churches together, during the Ottoman period, there was by necessity some interaction between them. And I'm only going to briefly mention this because I've spent a lot of my life thinking and writing about it. And if I talk too long about it, I will go down a rabbit hole. So I don't want to do that. If in questions we want to, we can. During the Ottoman period, a system of administration developed that the Ottomans, who were Muslims, Islamic rule, found a way to govern the Christians of the Ottoman Empire through their churches, basically. Taxes and things were paid through the churches. And there's a sort of story that shortly after Mehmet the Conqueror comes into Istanbul in 1453, that he takes the Patriarch of Constantinople and says, you're now in charge of all the Orthodox in the empire. Okay, great. Except that this Patriarch says, well, yeah, but there's a bunch of Christians in the empire that are not the same kind of Orthodox as we are. Well, the next biggest group were the Armenians. So a bishop was brought from Bursa, so the standard history goes, and put into the position of the Patriarch of Armenians in Constantinople. And this caused some sort of issues because actually there's a Catholicos in Etchmiadzin, there's a Catholicos at the time on the island of Akhtamar, there's a Catholicos in Sis, both of which are in the Ottoman Empire, but being the capital, the Patriarch had a lot of power. Now, there needs to be more historical work on this, actually. But the story that is generally accepted is that all of the Miaphysite churches were administered through the Armenian Patriarchate. We need more genuine historical work on this to understand exactly how this worked. But we can say that for the most part, especially with the Syriacs, there was some coordination. We know this because in the 19th century, there's like letters from Syriacs being like, I don't want to pay my taxes to the Armenian bishops, which suggests that they were in fact paying their taxes to the Armenian bishops. So during the Ottoman period, these churches, especially the Coptic, Armenian, and Syriac, were sort of brought together by means of Ottoman administration. So we could call this a bit of the prehistory of the idea of all of these churches being a single family. Of course, the genocide sort of puts ruin to the life of Christians in Anatolia, right? It totally changes. And I put this up here in large part because one of the things that we should think about when we think about the unity of the Oriental Orthodox churches is that the Syriac Christians especially were very, very, very affected by the genocide. They call it the Sipho, the sword. And so when we talk about the Armenian genocide, I think it's important actually to keep in mind that a lot of Syriac Christians were also deported and massacred at the same time. And in fact, today, the Syriac Orthodox Church is headquartered out of Syria, not out of its historic monasteries that were in Turkey. So in the same way that the Armenian Catholicosate located in Sis at the end of the Ottoman Empire in the throes of genocide left and is now located in Lebanon, the Syriac Patriarch also was forced out of his see as well. So I just want to mention that, as we enter the 20th century, these churches that had been connected in a way through Ottoman administration were also in a similar situation of genocidal violence and therefore dispersion. So in Europe, it looks a little bit different, but actually in America, the patterns of migration are really similar. So you see Syriac Christians and Armenian Christians arriving in America around the same time, and often together. There's George Kiras actually recently alerted me to the fact that one of the first newspapers of the Syriac community was in the greater Boston area. So same place where a lot of Armenians, especially from Harpert, went. And they actually published one of their first newspapers in Armenian because they were Armenian speakers, because there were so many connections between the communities in the Ottoman period. So the genocide throws these Christians around the world. Today, I want to think a little bit about their presence. Oh, here, this is a church in Mardin. And I wanted to put this up here to sort of underscore the fact that in the Ottoman period, and even actually throughout the Turkish Republican period, after 1923, there were Christians who stayed. There are still Christians there, living in lots of the parts of the former Ottoman Empire. And in those areas, especially in the Turabdin region, where there are villagers who have Armenian ancestry as well as Syriac ancestry, they continue to be integrated in the sort of social fabric together. They were very much so during the Ottoman period, and they continue to be to the extent that they are present there today. So I wanted to underscore that as one of these connections between especially the Syriac and the Armenian Church. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the genocide, a huge diaspora starts, especially with Armenians and Syriacs. But the 20th century is the century of migration in some ways, we could say. And over time, all of these different populations have moved around the globe and have set up in America, in Australia, and in Europe, which is going to be the focus of what I look at through the rest of this talk. So here's a map from, if you don't know Robert Hewson's Historical Atlas of Armenia, you should get it. It's a beautiful book. This is showing the Armenian presence in Western Europe. So we can see Hovagim Surpazan's seat there in London. We can see the bishopric in France. We can see the fact that there are a lot of churches in southern France. You see that there is an Armenian church in Amsterdam. So this is the sort of the Armenian presence post-genocide in Western Europe. This is a slightly out-of-date map, but the Coptic Church establishes itself in Europe a little bit later. Coptic migration and migration from Egypt in general really picked up pace after World War II and in the 60s and 70s. So the first Coptic church in Europe is here in London. It's St. Mark's Church in Kensington that was consecrated in 1978. So later than the Syriac and the Armenian presence, but today actually the Coptic church is very numerous. So you can actually see there's more Coptic dioceses than there are Armenian jurisdictions, dioceses, the way that they've chosen to divide up their jurisdictions. So today in Europe, and I've only got maps for these two, but today in Europe, all of these ancient churches that have had these historic connections are together in Europe. So we see here Coptic jurisdictions. We have the Armenian Church. The Syriac Church is well represented, especially in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in Sweden. I'm going to come to the case of Sweden specifically in a little bit. The Armenian Church, as I said, maybe we know this pretty well, but the diocese here in London, a French diocese, a diocese of Germany, what is called the Central Legation that covers Austria as well as Sweden, and what is called the Pontifical Legation that covers a lot of the rest of Western Europe. This is in addition to places where historically there have been more Armenians like Greece and further east. So I'm kind of being a little biased and limiting to Western Europe here. The Ethiopian and the Eritrean churches both have presences throughout Europe. The other church that I haven't gone too much into is called the Syro-Malankaran Orthodox Church. It is one of the other autocephalous Oriental Orthodox churches that is derived from the Syriac Church. They're sort of the smallest in presence in diaspora. But today, all of these Oriental Orthodox churches that have had these historic connections that I've outlined are present together in Europe. So what I want to think about for the rest of my talk is, what does that look like? What do these interactions look like today? And what does that mean? And what might that mean for all of these different churches in diaspora, especially in Europe? Most of my examples are going to come from Europe. So let me say at the outset that because all of these churches share this theological outlook, technically speaking, they are what we call them as being in communion, which is a very nice way of putting it, because it gives you the sort of the metaphorical idea of being together in communion, but it also refers to sacramental unity. It refers to literally the fact that any person who is a baptized member of one of these churches can take communion, is in communion with any of these other churches. All of the churches recognize the sacraments of the other churches. So I am a deacon of the Armenian Church. Technically speaking, I could serve on the altar of any of these churches. Now, as we saw, the Tewado rite looks totally different. I speak no Gez, classical Ethiopic. I do not know the rite. If I were to go on the altar in Ethiopian or Eritrean church, I would be completely lost. But technically, as a deacon, they will recognize me. And often in New York, this happens quite often. Every year they have con-celebrated liturgies where everybody comes together and they take turns doing the services from each of the churches and everybody participates. Full sacramental, liturgical, theological unity. So what does that look like and what kinds of things are happening today? The first thing to say is that a lot of this is top down. Okay? This is recognized. We know that this is reality. We can be in sacramental unity. But the things that happen are often initiatives done by the clergy or priests who get together or something organized like the Choir Fest, right? The Choir Fest was popular participation, but it took place at the cathedral church of one of the Coptic dioceses, was sponsored by the Coptic bishop. The Syriac bishop of the Netherlands was also present. So this is a kind of official activity of these churches working together. One of the interesting things that happens is that the governments of the different European countries almost encourage this unity. So what we have here, this is the St. Ignatius Institute. My Swedish is completely non-existent, which is based in actually Södertälje, a suburb of Stockholm. Why? This seems kind of why this suburb of Stockholm? Well, because the Syriac population there is huge. It's one of the most important sites for the Syriac Church in Europe, Stockholm and its suburb of Södertälje. And basically, because the Swedish government, the way that they deal with religious education has encouraged the formation of a single body to administer Orthodox education in Sweden. So the St. Ignatius Institute, named after an early saint that everybody agrees on, helps administer the education for all of the Orthodox. So it was founded in 2012. And as their website says, the Swedish society supports public education because it contributes to the continuing development of democracy. And so they basically receive government funds and support religious education at all levels. This includes, say, like sort of public popular education for adults, including some language education. It includes master's levels courses in Orthodox theology. And under the Institute, there are a number of seminaries, including a Coptic and a Syriac, at times an Eritrean, an Ethiopian, and a Byzantine Rite seminary. So clergy are trained under the auspices of this institute that brings together not only the Oriental Orthodox, but all of the Orthodox in Sweden. So I think this is an interesting example because the joint activity of these churches is actually encouraged and influenced by the state, by the government. The same has been true in the Netherlands. There, the St. Irenaeus Orthodox Theological Institute, which as of 2021, is actually based at Radboud University, where my project is, where I work, does something similar. Religious education, master's levels program, and the support for clergy training. Again, this is because the government of the Netherlands has recognized two groups, one an Eastern Orthodox group called Okin, and these are acronyms, and an Oriental Orthodox grouping called Sokin that have come together to form a single association that administers education for all Orthodox in the Netherlands. So again, there's a bit of an impulse for government recognition, for access to resources that has encouraged the working together of all Orthodox in both of these cases, but also specifically the Oriental Orthodox. So we see in the Netherlands, there's this sort of upper body of all Orthodox, and then two bodies for the Eastern and for the Oriental Orthodox. So these are some of the sort of official ones. This is outside of Europe, but I include SCOOCH, which might be the best acronym ever. The Standing Conference of Oriental Orthodox Churches. So you see here many of the hierarchs, as well as theologians. That there might be some familiar faces for many of you here, who come together on a regular basis. It's a rather I mean, it's formal in the sense that many of them are hierarchs, but it is just to be in fellowship with each other, to discuss issues that come up for each of these communities, to think about confronting those issues as the Oriental Orthodox churches. So again, you can see by a group of people largely in liturgical garb, and indeed many of them being high-ranking hierarchs, bishops. This one's quite, I mean, you can see now Bishop Daniel in the back, clearly not the primate, because Hajag Serpazan is in the front. This is the one that they still have on their website. I pulled this today. So this is the picture they put on their website. But yes, many of these hierarchs are in different places than New York now. And some of them who were not hierarchs are now bishops. Yes, it's an older picture, but you see all of these churches coming together again at the hierarchical level. So again, a lot of this coordination is happening at this level. To sort of move towards the end here, I want to end with thinking a little bit about more what we could call popular or sort of daily life moments where these churches are connected. So this here is a picture of the Armenian church in Södertälje. It's the only Armenian church, consecrated church in all of Scandinavia. You will note that it's in the same suburb of Stockholm where the St. Ignatius Institute is, and where there is a huge Syriac population. I show you this picture because one of the interesting things in Sweden is because there are so many Syriac Christians, there are way more Syriac churches than there are, say, Armenian churches. Now, Södertälje is in the far sort of southwest of Stockholm. A lot of Armenians also live in the far northeast of Stockholm. There is no permanent Armenian church in the northeast of Stockholm. There is a Syriac church in that region. And I've been told that a lot of Armenians, especially those who were born in the southern part of Turkey, near the picture that I showed you with Mardin, or Turabdin area, which is the heartland of the Syriac church, where many people have then moved to Stockholm, Syriacs. The Armenians who either are from that region or who had Syriac encounters in Syria will often go to the Syriac church. And again, you're in full communion. Why not? You can receive communion there, especially if you are from the same region. Some of these are people who were neighbors in Turkey who are now neighbors in Stockholm. What I've been told is that often Armenians will go to the Syriac church for just normal Sunday because it's closer to where they live. But often for the sacraments, for the baptism of a child, for a wedding, they will then go to the actual Armenian church here in Södertälje. So just sort of thinking about what this looks like. There still seems to be something that draws people to their individual churches for these life moments that are represented by the sacraments. But for a Sunday, why not go to one of the other churches, especially if it's closer? So this is one way in which daily life sort of has these interactions happening. And we can talk more about this with questions, but I think it's an interesting thing to note that it tends to relate to sort of geographic proximity, both in what we could call the homelands and in diaspora, right? So this seems to happen where you've got Armenians who come from areas where there are lots of Syriacs who then are living in Stockholm near lots of Syriacs. But I know of other examples of this kind of thing happening. I know, for instance, in America, in the New York area, where there's a large Coptic population as well as a large Armenian population, a lot of Armenians will happily go to Armenian church for liturgy and will often attend Coptic youth group meetings. Now, we can talk about maybe why that might be. I've got my own ideas about that, but you see these kinds of daily life interactions between these churches, that people recognize that they are part of a family of churches and can be in communion with them. I'll end by moving to the project that I'm a part of right now to talk about a couple other ways in which we see the interactions between these churches. So my current research project, I'm part of a team at Radboud University. The project is called Rewriting Global Orthodoxy. And we're looking at all of these Oriental Orthodox churches, largely through the publications that they have produced in Europe over the last 50 years. Now, that might mean actual books, but it often means, say, your little, what we like to call in Armenian, tertiks, little papers that you put out with your Sunday bulletin monthly for the churches as a way of understanding the church's life in Europe over the last 50 years. And so we've been going around Europe to all of these different communities collecting their books. So this is a screenshot of the public database that we have been building. Still being added. I gathered a couple things from Manchester the other day that I'll be putting into the database here. I bring this up not only to plug the project that I'm working on and hopefully the future fruits of our research, but to point out a couple interesting things. So this here is the cover of two separate books that are Eastern Armenian translations of the writings of the late Patriarch of Alexandria, of the Coptic Church, Pope Shenouda. Pope Shenouda was an incredibly popular figure who wrote and gave sermons. I mean, you can find his writings everywhere. He printed and published so many of his sermons and put out little booklets. He helped change the way the Coptic Church does their religious education and is a major figure. In our database, I would guess that he is represented in nearly all of the languages. He's translated by all of the different churches. And I mean, I would guess he's probably the single largest author represented in our database. And here we have Eastern Armenian translations of the works of Pope Shenouda. He writes in a popular style that is accessible. He talks about spirituality for the contemporary moment. It's stuff that appeals to the average devout Christian and is accessible to them. So I find it, on the one hand, not surprising and also kind of exciting to see these Armenian translations. And he's been translated into, again, the languages of all of these churches. So here's another example of how there's a circulation, a movement, a recognition that the spirituality of each of these churches is and can be and perhaps should be relevant for each other. Shenouda is a great example of that. And then my last slide here is from Facebook. This is a page that I don't know all the background of. I'm not really sure who administers it. I think it's somebody in Armenia. It's called Hokevor Zerutsner. We can translate that as spiritual conversations or spiritual dialogues. And what this person does, whoever is doing this, is almost daily, a few times a week, putting short little snippets of often patristic old Christian fathers, but often also more recent Christian fathers from other Orthodox traditions. I've been following, I haven't been systematic about it, but I've been sort of following what this person puts up there. And it tends to be, I suspect they're doing their own translations in a lot of cases, of different Orthodox thinkers, both Eastern and Oriental. So this one I picked, I particularly like. We see Surp Isahag Asori, Saint Isaac the Assyrian, the Syrian, probably referring to Saint Isaac of Nineveh, who is a very renowned and important saint for the Syriac Orthodox Church. And then we also have here below Saint Hovhannes Sinaietsi, who I'm not totally sure who that would refer to in this case. So this person is translating things from the other Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches to give, what we could call sort of spiritual food to the, what's he got? 14,000 followers reading in Armenian. So I'm going to end with that. That shows what I think is this really sort of popular spirituality that is shared between the churches, that offers the idea that this family of churches has something to offer each other. And that there are these, what we could call cross-fertilizations between them. And in diaspora, there are these interactions. And that is my sort of basic point. And I look forward to talking a little bit more and taking questions about that. And for now, for those of you online, I'm going to stop sharing, but if there's a question about a slide, I'll happily share again and we can look at the slides. Yes, Sir Pozan, please.
If I were to speak to theological students, I would say that the only thing that unites us is the rejection of Chalcedon, because we got with these churches Christological, liturgical, theological, ecclesiological differences. But if I'm to speak to you, I have to say that the cross of Jesus Christ unites us because all these churches are churches of martyrs, because they have suffered throughout the history and all. And during the recent years, we got united and we worked together. And for just after 1965, when they had first meeting, it was when ecumenical movement was in momentum. And in 1962, all the churches became a World Council member of World Council of Churches, and they had to start dialogue with the Eastern Orthodoxy. So they had to form an alliance, sort of. This is why Haile Selassie invited this. But this is interesting. After that, as the heads of Oriental Orthodox churches, they hadn't met until 2015, when they met in Holy Eshmiadzin, when we were canonizing the martyrs of Armenian genocide. Only Ethiopian patriarch couldn't come because on that day, actually, on the day of his trouble, I remember because I was ecumenical officer and organizing this, there was an explosion and these Libyan 21 Christians.
It was that day that he was traveling.
Something happened because of this didn't come. This is one thing we have to register here. And one more thing, I will not, when you make next presentation, I'll give a picture from Armenian Church in London, because we come together for theophany songs, Oriental and Eastern churches. We do it in our cathedral, not in Coptic or Syriac cathedral.
Great.
I'll stop here because if I start speaking, it will be another lecture.
No, thank you. Thank you, Sir Bozan. This is great. And this is, I mean, learning these details, this is part of why I was in Sweden just a couple of weeks ago. And so I'm excited that I got to share some of these things, and being here, part of that is to learn exactly what is happening in all of these different communities.
Thinking actually to bring one of them, and I read Susan Zimmer once more. Sorry, I did not read carefully. It gave me idea.
I said you could.
Yeah. But I'll introduce you with other bishops.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I just to add, I think one of the things that Sir Pozan mentioned that is really important that I didn't really touch on at all is the sort of worldwide ecumenical movement and placing that in the context of this. So one of the things that I didn't really talk about that is more theological is the discussion, especially with the Eastern Orthodox churches. So there's a long history of dialogue, well, through the 20th century, especially of dialogue between different sets of churches. Perhaps most importantly, between the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox, but also the Anglican Church, for instance, has been a great partner in conversation. There have been specific conversations with the Catholic Church. With regard to the Eastern, which? Evangelical, yeah. So it's the sort of the context of the worldwide ecumenical movement, I think, is something important to put here. And I didn't talk about these dialogues, but there have been a series of dialogues, especially between the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox churches. For those of you who are interested, there's a book that's called "Does Chalcedon Divide or Unite?" That gives kind of a background of these, and every time these bishops get together, they release a statement. And so it's got actually the statements from a number of these meetings as well. So yeah.
It would be very useful also to people to read the sermon of the late Catholicos Cardinal I, which she delivered in 1997 in Rome, in Colosseum. He was leading the procession of Holy Cross. So it's very speaks about ecumenical, the position of the Armenian Church in relations with other churches.
Thank you. That's a great source. Yeah, a lot of I like whenever I pick up that book about Chalcedon, I love looking at the list because Cotachine I was a huge important member of these ecumenical conversations. Another person throughout the 20th century, Archbishop Tiran Nersoyan, who has connections both here and to New York, was another person who took many sort of figures that we know quite well from the Armenian side were involved in these ecumenical conversations. So I think that's
he was the bishop. He was the head of the seminary in Addis Ababa for the Ethiopian church.
So yeah, this is the sort of the worldwide ecumenical movement, and the conversations with the Eastern Orthodox, I think, is an important piece that I didn't spend a lot of time with. So thank you. Others, yeah.
Yeah, we have questions in the chat.
Great. I don't know. Are you gonna read them? Is that the easiest way to do it? Great.
So this one is from Margaret, and she asks, if an Armenian child is baptized in the Syriac Church, can that child then be married in the Armenian Church?
Yes.
And is this communion that Syriac?
Yeah. So this is I mean, these are the sort of, I have a hierarch in the room, so I should be careful, but the pure ecumenical, desire that I have would be to say that, Christians should recognize all of these things. But if we're talking specifically theologically, absolutely, there is no difference sacramentally between any of these Oriental Orthodox churches. So if you are baptized in one of them and get baptized one day, get communion the next Sunday in the Coptic church, and get married in the Armenian church the week after, that is 100% what this family of churches means. Pure, complete recognition of each other's sacramental and liturgical life. So yes.
And we have another question in the chat. How do respective hierarchies work? Does the Coptic Pope have any status in any of the other Oriental churches, the Catholicos in any other, etc., or just respected as quote cousin clergy?
Yeah, so more closer to the second one. And actually, one of the things that I think is really quite special about this branch of Christianity, the Oriental Orthodox, is that we group all of them together, and they're basically all autocephalous, unique churches. They have their own unique traditions. They have their own unique theologies. They have their own unique liturgical rites. If you go to a Tehuato rite divine liturgy, it will look totally, not totally different. There are patterns and structures that you will actually find familiar, but it's in a different language. The modes of singing, all of these things will be different, yet we have unity. And it's quite unique in the world of Christendom, actually, because even the Eastern Orthodox, technically speaking, they all recognize, well, this is a controversial thing to say in 2023, but technically speaking, the ecumenical patriarch who sits in Constantinople is the nominal head he is the first among equals of all the other Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Rite churches. There have been problems now. The Moscow Patriarchate there have been more splits. But there is a sense in which, in some way, that is all one sort of connected branch, in a way that the Oriental Orthodox Church hierarchies are really autocephalous. They are their own hierarchies, and there are historical connections between them. So I think I sort of mentioned that for many centuries, the Tehuato Rite, the Ethiopian, now the Ethiopian and the Eritrean church, the Tehuato Rite churches they developed their own distinct liturgical life. They used Gez. They, came up with their own way of celebrating the divine liturgy, but technically the head of their church was still under the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Coptic Pope, until the middle of the 20th century. So there are historical connections between these churches. But today, each of those churches that I mention as members of the Oriental Orthodox family are equally autocephalous and meet each other as equals. Yeah.
Unity in mission. Unity in mission.
Unity and mission. Yeah.
This is a new term.
I like that.
Diversity and unity in mission. Because we Armenians know about Ethiopian, but Syriacs, for instance, have the same questions with Indo-Malankaran.
Yes.
Coptics have the same question with Eritrean and Ethiopian churches. So always you have these problems, but at the same time, it doesn't disturb us to or make big problems to carry on our mission. And here we have Syriac bishop, Indian bishop, Coptic bishop. Why Ethiopians, they don't, we work together.
Like that unity and mission. Yeah, Susan.
A question on a different aspect of your very rich talk. Thank you. I'm interested to know more about you briefly mentioned seminaries are supported and sort of somehow given a framework by the state, I believe, how I understood that. And it reminded me of the way in which state governments elsewhere, what's the polite word to use? Support certain aspects of ethnic groups and certain people within ethnic groups, certain people with whom they're able to cooperate. They like to name somebody as a head of the ethnic group so they can deal with that group. Is there any similarity with that going on within the seminaries, or what is the relationship really of the state?
Of the state to those seminaries.
The education of these people, how far does it go?
My sense is that each of these organizations are given a decent amount of autonomy, and my sense is that it has a lot to do with available resources and the way that the state is sort of willing to sort of recognize, right? If you were to say, we require a certain level of bureaucratic work in order for you to be recognized, and we're going to recognize, the Armenians. Well, then why not recognize, the Cilician, Catholicos separate from the Ecumenical Catholicos? And I think in a lot of cases, my sense is that both the Dutch government and the Swedish government have said, okay, look you're not so many of you that we can sort of have a bureaucratic apparatus that is going to take each of you in your particularity. And so why don't you be the Orthodox, please? And then you figure it out among yourselves and then come to us as the Orthodox, and we're going to give you X amount of money as the Orthodox. So, there is a bit of, you could call it, governmental disciplinary power in a sense that sort of encourages and slots these groups into it. There might be a sense that, why can't we just be the Syriac Church in Sweden?
But even within the Syriac Church or the Armenian Church, you're going to have different divisions. And how does the government decide which group to have the conversation?
So it's actually what I learned on my trip to Sweden recently is that it's once these bodies are set up, the state doesn't do too much with it. They sort of say this body, in the Netherlands, it's OZI is the upper Orthodox body. It's in charge of your education, and your job is to do that. So in Sweden, for instance, the Armenians are not really participating right now. And that has to do with, the need and the desire for seminary education in Sweden and in Europe, but the Armenians are not represented right now at St. Ignatius. That's not because the Swedish government has said, oh, you Armenians, you will do your own thing. It's because the one governing body of St. Ignatius has approached the Armenians. And in fact, actually, the Armenian different parts of the community couldn't necessarily speak with one voice. And so St. Ignatius said, right now, we are waiting for a single voice to emerge. So the question of representation, in a sense, happens at the level of these organizations once the state has set that organization. Does that make sense?
Maybe the Syriac, it was created at the initiative of Syriac Orthodox Church. But as it is funded by the government, they have responsibility to open the doors to others. This is why they are inviting. This is why ours, they don't need it and they don't do it, because for us, there was a limit, and.
Exactly. They are basically, the Armenians have said, this kind of religious education is not necessary for us to join this initiative. But the point being that if, say, the Armenians were to say, we would like an Armenian seminary in Sweden, at that point, I can tell you the Swedish government would say, okay, go to St. Ignatios and work within that framework, because that's the framework we have set for Orthodox education within Sweden.
And just to be clear, that's because they are funding this?
In part, yes. Yep. In both. I'm not sure about funding on the Dutch side, but I know in the Swedish side, they receive not all of their money. It's not that their entire budget is not from the state, but a substantial portion comes from the state. They come from there are donations from around the world, because actually, a lot of, in the same way, for instance, we can say that St. Narcissus in New York, it's the only, it's the only Armenian seminary in the English speaking world in America. You could call it the only in a number of ways. So, perhaps somebody here would want to study, and maybe they will go to St. Narcissus. And so then, the bishop would sort of support his student at St. Narcissus. Similar things are happening with St. Ignatios, because it's one of the main Orthodox education places in Europe, frankly, in the world, actually, at this point. It's one of the largest Orthodox educational institutions. But yes, a substantial portion of their budget comes from the Swedish state. Yeah, you want to let's take a couple from there.
About 3 questions. There's actually one just about seminaries.
Okay.
And do each of these churches have their own seminaries? Which seems you answered some of that question. So maybe I'll go on to the second question here, which comes from Kim. And she asks, I live in England and not very close to an Armenian church, so I've always taken communion at the Church of England. They're very inclusive and have encouraged me to take communion. Does the Oriental Orthodox Church recognize this from the Church of England or Anglican churches?
Man, I'm getting tough question. It's like sweating questions, especially with a bishop in a room. But what I would say is that one thing is that these recognitions of each other's sacraments are often not what would you call that? Not equal. Like, so for instance, one might recognize and leave it up to the other. And then frankly, that's something that each individual believer, I think, should ask. Please.
So there is a Lima document in the ecumenical signed in Chile. Lima. Where is it? Chile.
Peru. Yeah, Lima, right?
Oh, probably. And it's a recognition of each other baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. So sacramentally, it's on the theological level. But on grassroots level, on the level of faithful, we got this problem. Our people go other churches, and when they come, they speak about ecumenical hospitality, but at the same time, we are not in communion with other churches. And so if strictly, religiously, based on canon law, I can say no, you can't go. But it depends on personal feeling. It's private. Anyone who thinks that he belongs to a certain church has to consult with his priest about this when he is away from the church, how we can deal with it. So here I'm a humanist, I think a little bit different. I can tell an example. I was in Jerusalem celebrating Mass on the tomb of Jesus Christ. A lady came, said, if she could take Holy Communion, I said, are you ready? She said, no. She was Catholic. Then on the tomb of Jesus Christ, who am I to say no to this woman to take Holy Communion? This is something different situation. I mean, but we are not in communion. We don't share the chalice, let's say. In the Coptic Church, in Syriac Church, in the Ethiopian Indian Church, yes. When Coptic Patriarch was ordained 2013. I was there as a part of delegation, and there was a delegation from Mount Elias. We were 5 Armenian bishops and archbishops. We laid our hands on the head of the Pope Tawadros and sang Urachlev. This is something new actually in history also. It means we are in communion, but
Yeah.
with other churches we are not.
And the other thing that I would just add is that I think there are probably very few pastors who would say that if you want to receive communion and there is nowhere that you can receive it, communion is better than not communion in a sense, yeah. But this is my ecumenical bent coming out as well. What you just said, Sirbazan, also, I would just, in terms of these sort of moments of ecumenism that I think are really interesting, at the recent elevation of 3 bishops, including Bishop Daniel Findikian a few years ago, the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch was present and took part in the service and was sort of recognized as one of the, because in order to consecrate a bishop, you need 3 bishops, and one of them should be a patriarch. And in fact, both the Catholicos Catechin II and the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch were present, in part because before he was the patriarch, he was the bishop in New York and knew Bishop Daniel as well as some of the other bishops quite well. So again, this is another example of where this sort of true, full sacramental unity is demonstrated. Yeah.
Well, just on that subject, though, if you think back to 1956 in Antillas, but that was forced on them because they didn't have enough bishops who were ready to. Anyway, I have a question about the collection of literature you gathered from various Oriental churches.
Great.
First question was, why were the Armenian ones in Eastern Armenian as opposed to Western Armenian? And the second question was, you said that there were translations of works by, say, Pope Shenouda into other languages. What Armenian authored works have been translated into any of the other languages?
Those are great questions. Thank you. So with the Eastern, those were just those 2 Shenouda books. So I haven't found a Western Armenian translation of Shenouda, in part because I would guess for Shenouda specifically, there's English language Shenouda, there is Arabic language Shenouda. So if you are a Western Armenian speaker in France, you can read Shenouda in French. If you're a Western Armenian speaker in America, you can read Shenouda in English.
But the other Armenian works were in Western mainly, or
we have a bit of both. A lot of the things that are published in Europe are often Western Armenian, especially if you look at the older things. If you look at things published in France in 1930, that's going to be almost exclusively in Western Armenian. If you look at stuff that's published today, you'll see a mix of that because the diasporic populations are a mix of Eastern and Western speakers. And the other thing is our collection is not only things that have been published in Europe, but things that we find in Europe. We're actually quite interested in the movements of these things. So for me, it's quite interesting when I go to Manchester and I see that some of the liturgical books are things that were printed in London in the 50s, and some of the liturgical books were printed in New York that are copies of things that were printed in Jerusalem, and some of them come from Antillas because everybody likes the new version of the Adani Jamakirk that they published in Antillas. It's a really nice size. So guess what? They have one there. So we're interested in these movements, the circulation of them as well. But for the Armenian, you see both at this point. We have both represented in the database. As for translations of other things from Armenian, not a whole lot. This is an emerging thing in general. We have recently, there's been this major project called the Matanakir Kayots that has collected a lot of the classical Armenian, sort of basically what we could call Armenian patristics, essentially. And they've given the definitive editions of a lot of these important Armenian theological works, sometimes for the first time in print, or the first time in print in 150 years. There's a Venice edition from 1820 that hasn't been, seen print until this edition came out. So we're seeing these translations from classical Armenian sort of slowly. People are working on putting them into English, and I hope that we will see more and more of that. And actually, I really hope that, I gave a talk yesterday where I was looking more at theological things, and there was a question about, well, should these enrich each other, right? Should the specific Christological texts of Armenians be in conversation with the Coptic Church? And my answer is sure, I think so. So I hope that we see more of this, but certainly in the database, like I don't think I saw, for instance, I mean, you'll see in Arabic, for instance, you'll see Arabic translations because of the large population of Armenians living in Arabic speaking countries. You do see some of the sort of classics of Armenian spirituality in Arabic, but like, I mean, is there a Syriac version of, Gregory the Illuminator's sermons? No, there's not even a full, well, actually, there's very recently from Dr. Abraham Tarian, an English translation of the sermons of St. Gregory the Illuminator. So
recent authors, I mean, Shenouda died not so long ago.
yeah.
Are there any modern Armenian authors who are translated into Arabic or?
Do you have an answer for me, Aaron?
A question, would it not benefit an Armenian author to become a cult figure like Shenouda?
I think, and I think if we've talked about this because Shenouda comes up in our group so often, because it's like, it seems like every other week somebody's like, I found another Shenouda book. I found a Shenouda book in this language. Let's put it in the database. I think actually, I mean, I'm looking straight at the very nice versions of Coptic the First works that have been collected, published very beautifully, most of them with English translation. I think he would be an author that should be in conversation and be put into conversation with the other Oriental Orthodox churches. You could think about some of the nice sort of more popular writing by figures in America, or some of the more introductory things. The work of Tiran Sirpazan, I think, is another figure that would be nice to put into Arabic, into Syriac. I can, there's, when you talk about these recent authors, I mean, frankly, no one has the stature, even in the Armenian church, that Pope Shenouda has in the Coptic church, I would say. I mean, again, looking at this collection, Coptic the First might be the only person of recent memory that has that sort of full stature that everybody would say, yeah, let's read what he's got. But I mean, I think Snork Patriarch of Istanbul has a number of nice pieces about saints. I think his work is another one that could and should make the rounds. But at this point, I mean, in our database, I don't see much evidence of that. I don't personally know of much evidence of it. But Aaron, to your question, I think it should. I hope so. I hope somebody translates Coptic Catholicos into Arabic.
Ara asks, what about Bibles? The Ethiopian Bible is longer. It has other books than the Armenians don't have. Any thoughts? And there was just a quick question from Margaret about, you mentioned the book Faith and Hope. Who is the author?
I'm racking my brain for that one. The Bible question is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, for instance, there is an Armenian Bible, and there's a nice English version that was done, I think, by the Western Diocese many years ago now in Los Angeles, that included what you could call apocryphal or extra canonical books that the Armenians have traditionally included in their Bible. So, for instance, famously, if you go to Armenian liturgy the night before Christmas or Easter, you might hear the Canticle of the Three Youth. There are portions of the book of Daniel that the Armenians preserve that you won't find in your NIV edition, for instance. Some of these, I believe the Canticle of the Three Youth is part of that apocryphal portion of Daniel. So you'll find in the Armenian Bible, basically the Armenians have said, no, we're gonna put this largely in the Bible. And the question refers to the fact that the other Oriental Orthodox churches, like the Ethiopians, have done so as well. I think in general, the sort of the study of these apocryphal things is super fascinating. You can find not just Bible differences, but what's generally called sort of apocryphal literature. There's a whole tradition of especially stories, what are called the infancy gospels, early stories about basically the life of Saint Mary and of Jesus, that are found in a lot of these traditions. And in fact, they're shared. So one of the interesting things is that all of the ancient churches celebrate things like, they all have feasts for Saints Joachim and Anna. Who are Saints Joachim and Anna? They're the parents of Saint Mary. Find that in the Bible. You're not going to. You will find it in these apocryphal works, but they clearly are very, very, very early, because all of the ancient churches except that St. Mary's parents were called Joachim and Anna. The Catholic Church does, we do, the Byzantine Church does, everybody accepts this, but it's not in the Bible. So this is maybe I don't have a strong answer to this or what you do with it, but I would say that I think there's a great benefit to looking at these kind of apocryphal texts and to beginning to think, you know, there's not a whole lot of study on who shares which apocryphal texts, who has slightly different versions. This is a really interesting question, and from a spirituality perspective, I would say totally beneficial. You know, read the infancy gospels, read the extra versions of Daniel. Why not?
We'll continue this conversation as we have some wine and some crisps and stuff. So I would like to say thank you so much. That was, as I said, a very rich, very complex, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I think, I hope somebody's listening out there who's going to make a donation to make translations. The wonderful Didisian family did so much with Karakin, the first works.
Right.
But perhaps they never heard about. I'm just wondering if some donors who do good works don't actually know about this project. So maybe there's a way to let them know, because certainly it's a great idea. And that would be I think a wonderful place to start. To everybody online, thank you for coming. To everybody in the room, thanks for coming. Please stay on for something to eat and continue the conversation. And all of you, if you have enjoyed this and would like to hear more, please do support the Armenian Institute. We'd be very, very grateful. We depend on everybody to keep on going. And those of you who haven't visited us here another time, please come to an event here. I think you'll enjoy our new space. If you think of us back in the old cave, you'll see something new and exciting when you come here. So again, a round of applause, please, for our wonderful speaker. And we'll say good night. And also, please,
Good night,
folks,
everybody online.
come to the concert on March 11th. We have a wonderful concert that will be in Surpsakis, a beautiful setting for a very beautiful concert. Good night, everybody.
Good night.